Margaret Turner settled onto her favorite bench in Willow Park, the wooden seat weathered by countless seasons. It was a mild afternoon, the kind that made the park feel timeless, with golden sunlight filtering through the towering willow trees and casting dappled patterns on the paved paths. The air smelled of damp earth and freshly cut grass, mingling with the subtle scent of the bread crumbs she carried in a small, paper bag. She sighed, shaking the bag gently, watching as a group of pigeons fluttered to the ground, their eager pecking creating a soft, rhythmic sound that had become oddly soothing over the years. This was her refuge, a place where the quiet stretched long enough to allow old memories to linger. Memories of laughter once filling her home, of a husband who would have chuckled at her habit of talking to birds, of children who had long since grown and moved away. Margaret didn't mind the solitude. At least, that's what she told herself. But today, something was different. Just as she reached for another handful of crumbs, she noticed movement from the corner of her eye. A child, no more than 8 years old, was walking toward her, hesitantly, her small frame tense as though she expected to be stopped at any moment. Margaret's first thought was that the girl must be lost. Her brown pigtails bounced slightly as she walked, and her hands, balled into trembling fists, clung to the fabric of her sweater. But it was her eyes that struck Margaret the most, wide, filled with something deeper than mere uncertainty. Fear. The child kept glancing over her shoulder, as though expecting someone to appear behind her. Instinctively, Margaret followed her gaze, scanning the quiet park. That's when she saw him. A man, standing just beyond the line of trees near the park's entrance. His dark clothing blended into the shade, making him almost unnoticeable. But once Margaret focused on him, she realized he wasn't simply standing, he was watching. His posture was too rigid, too still, his gaze fixed on the little girl with an intensity that sent a chill through Margaret's bones. Her heart picked up its pace. The girl's steps quickened as she drew closer. Margaret didn't move, didn't even blink, afraid that any sudden motion might startle the child. The girl hesitated just a few feet away, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the words that made Margaret's stomach drop. "Please, pretend you know me." Margaret's mind raced. There was no hesitation, no doubt in her instincts. She straightened, opening her arms in an inviting gesture, her voice warm and loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Oh, sweetheart," she exclaimed, her heart pounding beneath the practiced ease of her tone. "Come give your grandmother a big hug." The girl didn't hesitate. She practically threw herself into Margaret's embrace, her small body trembling against the older woman's. Margaret held her tightly, shielding her as best as she could, her eyes flickering back to the stranger in the distance. He had stiffened. Margaret could feel his hesitation from where she sat today. He was assessing, recalculating. She didn't know what he wanted, but every part of her screamed that it was something sinister. Forcing herself to maintain the charade, she pulled the child onto the bench beside her, patting her knee. "Sit down, dear," she said lightly, as if they were merely catching up. "Tell me all about school." The little girl, who still hadn't said her name, clung to Margaret's hand like a lifeline. She nodded slightly, swallowing hard, as though struggling to compose herself. Margaret leaned in, lowering her voice. "Is he following you?" The girl barely moved her lips as she whispered back, "For days." Margaret suppressed the shudder that threatened to travel down her spine. This child had been running, alone, frightened, and desperate. And now, she was sitting beside her, trusting Margaret to protect her. She forced a reassuring smile, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "Well, your mother will be expecting you home soon, won't she? Let me just give her a quick call to let her know you're safe." Margaret reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against her phone. She knew she had to be careful. If she spooked the man watching them, he might act rashly. If she delayed too long, he might take it as a sign that she was catching on. Keeping her voice casual, she pressed the emergency dial and lifted the phone to her ear. "Oh, hello, dear," she said as if speaking to a loved one. "Yes, we're just sitting here in Willow Park, enjoying the sunshine." "Oh yes, we're having a lovely time." She gripped the phone tightly, her gaze locked onto the stranger. "But there's a man here, watching us. He won't leave." The words left her lips in a measured, steady tone, as though she were talking about the weather. But her stomach twisted as she saw the stranger shift. He knew. Margaret braced herself. The girl whimpered beside her, her grip tightening. What if he doesn't stop? Margaret squeezed her hand. He will, she murmured. I promise. Then, just as the tension in the air became unbearable, the distant sound of sirens pierced the quiet. Margaret felt the girl's tiny body sag in relief. The man, however, stiffened. For a split second, he seemed to consider his options. Then, as flashing blue and red lights appeared at the park's entrance, he bolted. Margaret exhaled sharply as the tension snapped. A commanding voice rang through the park. Police! Don't move! The officers sprinted forward, their rapid movements breaking the unnatural stillness that had settled over the park. Margaret held Sophie protectively as they watched the officers chase after the man, their figures vanishing through the trees. She barely registered the presence of a uniformed officer approaching her, his face lined with concern. Are you all right? Margaret nodded, though her hands were still shaking. We're safe now, she whispered, pulling the child closer. We're safe. The officer crouched beside the bench, his gaze softening as he looked at the girl. You were very brave, young lady. Do you know that man? Sophie swallowed hard, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He said he knew my parents. Her voice wavered. That he was my uncle. Margaret felt the girl tense again, as if suddenly realizing something. But I don't have an uncle. The officer's expression darkened. He glanced at Margaret, then back at Sophie. It's all right, he said gently. You're safe now. Margaret looked down at the child nestled against her. She had only met her moments ago, yet already, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't letting go. The siren still echoed in Margaret's ears as she kept her arms wrapped securely around Sophie, unwilling to loosen her grip even as the immediate danger passed. She could still see flashes of blue and red reflecting against the tree trunks, officers moving swiftly in pursuit of the man who had fled moments ago. Though the tension had begun to ease, Margaret knew this wasn't over yet. The officer crouching beside them, his name tag reading Detective Ryan Holt, kept his expression calm, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that told Margaret he understood the gravity of the situation. Sophie, he said gently, can you tell me your full name, sweetheart? The little girl hesitated. Her small fingers gripped Margaret's sleeve as if afraid that the moment she let go, she'd be left unprotected. Margaret gave her a reassuring squeeze. You're safe now, dear, she murmured. No one is going to hurt you. Sophie swallowed hard. Sophie Dawson, she finally said, her voice small, uncertain. Detective Holt nodded and jotted something down in a small notebook. Good, Sophie. And how old are you? 8. Margaret felt her chest tighten. 8 years old. Just a child. What had she been through these past few days? And you said the man told you he was your uncle? Holt continued. Sophie nodded, her eyes still darting toward the park entrance as if expecting him to reappear. But I don't have an uncle, she whispered. He kept following me. Every day. I saw him outside my school. And yesterday, he was near my house. Margaret inhaled sharply. The idea of this little girl being watched, hunted, without anyone noticing sent a shudder down her spine. How long had Sophie been living in fear? Did you tell anyone, sweetheart? Margaret asked softly, brushing a loose strand of hair from the child's tear-streaked face. Sophie hesitated before shaking her head. I wanted to. But, her voice faltered, and she bit her lip, glancing down at her lap. But what? Holt prompted, his voice careful, as if he already knew the answer. Sophie's lower lip trembled. I didn't think they'd believe me, she admitted, barely above a whisper. Mom and Dad are always busy. They say not to make up stories. That I worry too much. Margaret's heart ached at those words. She knew what it was like to be unheard, to feel invisible. She gently cupped Sophie's small hand in hers. Well, you did the right thing coming to me today, she said firmly. And we believe you, Sophie. You are not alone in this. Holt gave her a nod of approval before turning back to Sophie. Do you know where your parents are right now? Sophie blinked rapidly, as if trying to remember. They went to work this morning. But when I ran away, I didn't know where to go. So I came here. Margaret stiffened. Ran away? Sophie's grip tightened around her hand. I saw him again, she admitted. Outside my house. This time. He was across the street. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. But I knew he was waiting for something. I got so scared that I left. I didn't even tell anyone. I just ran. Margaret swallowed the lump forming in her throat. The thought of this small child wandering the streets alone, trying to escape a predator, made her feel sick. You were very brave to trust me, Margaret said softly, brushing her thumb over the back of Sophie's hand. And now we're going to make sure you get home safe. Detective Holt stood up, his radio crackling as an update came through. Margaret couldn't make out the exact words, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. What is it? She asked, a quiet urgency in her voice. The man fled on foot, Holt said grimly. We're searching the area, but he had a head start. Margaret's stomach twisted. He was still out there. Holt exhaled and turned back to Sophie. Sweetheart, do you know your parents' phone numbers? Sophie hesitated before shaking her head. They're in my mom's phone. Margaret immediately pulled out her own phone. Let me look them up, she said. They must be listed in the directory. As she scrolled through the search results, Holt stepped away to relay more information to the officers. Margaret cast another glance at Sophie, who was rubbing her arms as if suddenly feeling cold. Are you okay, dear? Margaret asked gently. Sophie nodded, but her small body was still trembling. Margaret's heart clenched. She had never been a mother to a scared child before, but she felt something protective surge within her, something instinctive. I won't leave you, Sophie, she said, reaching over to wrap her cardigan around the child's shoulders. Not until you're home and safe. A few moments later, Holt returned. I have officers heading to your parents' house now, he said. They'll contact them as soon as possible. Sophie swallowed. Are they mad at me? Margaret shook her head. No, dear. They're just worried about you. They love you. Sophie didn't respond, but her eyes flickered with something that resembled hope. Holt's radio buzzed again, and this time, he nodded in satisfaction. We got in touch with them. They're on their way here now. Margaret let out a relieved breath. Finally, Sophie's family would be here. But her relief was short-lived. Because just as she was about to reassure Sophie, something in the distance caught her attention. A shadow. A figure standing beyond the tree line. Margaret's pulse quickened. Lucas. Even with the flashing police lights in the distance, he was still watching. Margaret instinctively pulled Sophie closer, but before she could react further, Holt had already turned, following her gaze. His body tensed. Stay here, he ordered, his voice sharp as he moved toward his radio. This is Detective Holt. Suspect spotted near the east end of Willow Park. Moving now. Within seconds, more officers were sprinting in that direction. Sophie's small hand gripped Margaret's. His back, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret didn't let her fear show. She tightened her hold on the girl. He won't get to you, she promised. Sophie buried her face against Margaret's side as sirens blared once more, the chase resuming. Margaret held on to her, praying that this time, they would catch him. Margaret held Sophie close as Detective Holt and the other officers sprinted toward the tree line. The moment felt suspended in time, as though the air itself had thickened, trapping them in the weight of uncertainty. Sophie's tiny fingers clung to Margaret's cardigan, her body trembling. Despite the warmth of the fabric wrapped around her shoulders. He's not going to get to you, sweetheart, Margaret whispered, keeping her voice steady, even as her own pulse pounded in her ears. Sophie nodded against her side, but she didn't speak. Margaret forced herself to remain calm, though every fiber of her being screamed to stand up, to put herself between this child and the man lurking in the shadows. But she knew rash actions could put them both at risk. Instead, she kept her posture composed, her expression serene, even as her sharp eyes followed the frantic movements of the officers in the distance. Holt was leading the charge, his broad figure moving with purpose as he barked orders into his radio. The officers spread out in a formation, their voices carrying through the quiet of the park. The flashlights they carried cut through the dimming light, sweeping across the trees, illuminating brief glimpses of movement. Then, a shout. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. One of the officers had spotted him. Suspect heading east. Moving fast. A loud crash echoed through the park, branches snapping, leaves rustling violently. Margaret could barely make out the dark silhouette of Lucas Grant sprinting through the trees, weaving between trunks with unsettling speed. He was running, but he wasn't panicking. No. He was too controlled, too calculated. Margaret felt Sophie stiffen, a whimper catching in her throat. "It's okay," Margaret murmured, her protective instinct surging. She smoothed a reassuring hand over Sophie's hair. "He won't get far. There are too many officers here now." Sophie nodded weakly but refused to lift her head. Margaret kept her gaze locked on the scene unfolding before them. Lucas was fast, but the officers were gaining on him. Just as one of them lunged forward in an attempt to grab him, he twisted sharply, darting between two trees and vanishing into a denser patch of forest. "Damn it," one of the officers growled. Margaret's stomach twisted. "He's getting away. Circle around." Holt's voice was sharp, commanding. "He's heading toward the eastern perimeter. We need units on the road now." Another voice crackled through the radio. "Perimeter officers in position. We'll intercept." Margaret's heart clenched. Would they stop him? Or would he slip away, disappearing like smoke into the city beyond the park? Sophie seemed to sense the tension thickening in the air. She finally lifted her head, her wide, tear-brimmed eyes searching Margaret's face. "What if they don't catch him?" she whispered. Margaret swallowed hard. "They will." The words were firm, resolute. But in truth, Margaret wasn't sure. Lucas had been watching Sophie for days, possibly longer. He had studied her, learned her patterns, waited for the right moment. And now that he had been seen, exposed, he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Margaret felt it in her bones. And if he got away today? Would he come back? A sharp voice cut through the air. "Suspect is moving toward the east exit. Officers in pursuit." Then, silence. A long, stretching silence. Margaret gripped Sophie's hand. The girl whimpered, pressing closer. Then, a scuffle, shouting, the sound of bodies hitting the ground. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. More shouting. Muffled, indistinct. Then a single voice, clear over the rest. "We got him." Margaret's body sagged in relief. Sophie let out a small, hiccuping sob, her fingers gripping Margaret's cardigan so tightly that her knuckles turned white. One of the officers emerged from the tree line, his radio at his mouth. "Suspect detained," he confirmed. "Requesting a transport unit now." Detective Holt appeared next, his expression grim but victorious. He spotted Margaret and Sophie, still seated on the bench, then strode toward them, his breath heavy from exertion. "He's in custody," he assured them. "We got him." Margaret nodded, exhaling deeply, but her relief was only partial. Because capturing him was only the beginning. Lucas Grant had been following Sophie for days. Why? What did he want? And what if there were others like him? Margaret shifted, repositioning Sophie so she was fully enclosed in her arms. She didn't care what happened next: interviews, reports, long hours at the police station. She wasn't letting go of this child. Not yet. Later, at the police station. The bright fluorescent lights of the police station were a stark contrast to the soft, natural glow of the park. Margaret sat stiffly in a chair near the front desk, holding a paper cup of lukewarm tea that she had no intention of drinking. Sophie sat beside her, small and silent, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to her. Across the room, Holt and another officer were speaking in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in their direction. Lucas had been placed in holding for now, but there were questions, so many questions. Margaret couldn't stop replaying everything in her mind. The way Sophie had run to her. The sheer terror in her eyes. The cold, calculating presence of the man who had been watching. She had stepped in today because she had to. Because no child should have to face that kind of fear alone. But something deep inside told her that she was meant to be here. That meeting Sophie hadn't just been fate. It was a purpose. A door opened down the hallway, and Margaret straightened as she recognized the two figures who stepped inside. A man and woman, their expressions wild with panic, eyes darting around the station until they landed on the tiny form of Sophie. "Mom. Dad." Sophie shot out of her chair before Margaret could react, sprinting toward them. Her mother sobbed as she fell to her knees, gathering Sophie into her arms, rocking her back and forth as if reassuring herself that she was real, that she was safe. Her father wrapped his arms around them both, his face buried in Sophia's hair, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion. Margaret felt the breath leave her lungs. The moment she had been waiting for, the reunion. The part where she was supposed to step back, slip away quietly, let the family heal. But then, Sophie turned around. And her small hand reached for Margaret. "Mom," Sophie's voice wavered, muffled against her mother's shoulder. "This is Margaret. She saved me." Margaret froze. Sophie's mother lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes locking onto Margaret's. A mixture of gratitude, guilt, and overwhelming relief flooded her features. Margaret's lips parted, unsure of what to say. But before she could speak, Sophie's father stepped forward. And in the next moment, Margaret found herself enveloped in an embrace. A family's gratitude. A feeling Margaret hadn't experienced in so long. Something inside her shifted. She had thought this day was over. But it was only the beginning. Margaret Turner had always believed that some moments in life changed a person forever. Sitting in the police station, watching Sophie reunited with her parents, she knew this was one of those moments. Sophie's mother, Emily Dawson, clung to her daughter as though she was afraid to let go. Her shoulders shook with sobs, relief and guilt interwoven in the way she whispered Sophie's name over and over. Sophie's father, David Dawson, was quieter, but no less overwhelmed. He knelt beside his wife and daughter, his strong hands trembling as he smoothed back Sophie's disheveled hair. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, as though the weight of what could have happened was finally sinking in. Margaret sat back in her chair, gripping the paper cup of tea the officers had given her. It had long since gone cold, but she found comfort in holding on to something, anything, as she watched the emotional reunion unfold. She had done what she needed to do. Sophie was safe now. This was where she was supposed to slip away, let the family have their moment. But she couldn't move. Not when Sophie turned in her mother's arms and reached for her. Margaret blinked in surprise as Sophie tugged at her sleeve, her small fingers curling around the fabric of Margaret's cardigan. "Grandma Margaret," Sophie said, her voice still fragile from all the fear and exhaustion she had endured. "Don't leave." Margaret's heart squeezed. She knew the girl had simply used the grandma title as a means of protection back at the park, but hearing it now, in this setting, felt different. Emily Dawson finally looked up, her tear-streaked eyes locking onto Margaret's for the first time. "You," she swallowed, her voice cracking. "You saved my daughter." Margaret shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the center of attention. "I just happened to be in the right place," she murmured. David Dawson stood up, crossing the space between them in 2 steps. Before Margaret could react, he reached down and took her hand in his own, squeezing it tightly. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were exactly where you needed to be." Margaret's throat tightened. She had spent so many years alone. So many afternoons in the park, feeding birds, watching families pass by as though she was just another fixture in the background. But today, she had mattered. Before she could find the words to respond, Detective Holt approached, a serious expression on his face. He nodded respectfully at the Dawsons before turning to Margaret. "Miss Turner, I need to ask you a few questions before we move forward with charges against Lucas." "Grant?" Margaret sat up straighter, nodding. "Of course." Emily and David exchanged a glance before Emily gently ran a hand down Sophie's back. "Sweetheart, why don't we get you something to eat? The nice officers have snacks, and I bet you're hungry." Sophie hesitated, her fingers tightening around Margaret's sleeve. Margaret smiled at her, brushing a piece of hair from her face. "I'm not going anywhere, dear." That seemed to reassure her, and with one last squeeze of Margaret's hand, Sophie allowed her parents to lead her toward the station break room. Margaret turned back to Holt. "What do you need to know?" The detective exhaled, flipping open his notepad. "First, I need to go over your call to 911. You were smart, keeping things casual, speaking in code. You never once directly stated that you were in immediate danger, yet you made it clear enough that dispatch sent officers. That likely prevented the suspect from escalating his behavior." Margaret nodded, remembering how carefully she had chosen her words. "I didn't want to startle him," she admitted. "If he had sensed I was calling the police, he might have reacted poorly." Holt's eyes darkened slightly. You're right. People like him, they calculate every move. If he felt cornered, he might have taken drastic measures. He paused before continuing. Can you walk me through everything again? From the moment you noticed Sophie. Margaret took a deep breath and recounted the events. She described how Sophie had approached. The fear in her eyes, the way she had clung to her as if she were her last hope. She described Lucas Grant's presence, the way he lurked, his calculating gaze, the eerie stillness of his posture. Holt took notes, nodding occasionally. When Margaret finished, he set his pen down and sighed. Miss Turner, I don't want to alarm you, but Lucas Grant isn't just some ordinary criminal. Margaret's stomach tightened. What do you mean? We've had our eyes on him for a while, Holt admitted. He has a record, nothing major. Nothing that's ever landed him in prison, but enough to raise suspicion. Reports of him following children near schools, lingering in parks. He shook his head. But this is the first time we've had solid evidence. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. You mean to tell me he's been stalking children for years? And this is the first time anyone's done anything about it? Holt's jaw tensed. Unfortunately, it's hard to make a case without direct evidence. But tonight, thanks to you, we have enough to charge him with attempted child abduction. Margaret exhaled sharply. It wasn't enough. She wanted to be certain that man would never walk free again. What happens next? She asked. He'll be processed, questioned, and likely held until we can formally press charges, Holt said. But the real focus right now needs to be on Sophie. Margaret frowned. What do you mean? Holt rubbed the back of his neck. You heard her earlier, she didn't think her parents would believe her? That worries me. It means she may have been showing signs of distress for days, and no one noticed. Margaret swallowed hard, her thoughts flashing back to Sophie's hesitant voice when she had admitted she hadn't told anyone about Lucas following her. Emily and David loved their daughter, that was obvious. But love wasn't always enough. Children needed to be heard, to be believed, even when what they were saying seemed impossible. Holt sighed. I've seen it too many times, Miss Turner. A child tries to speak up, but no one listens. Until it's almost too late. Margaret felt something shift inside her. She had done what she could today, but Sophie still needed someone. She won't go through this alone, Margaret said firmly, surprising even herself. I'll make sure of that. Holt raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at his lips. You a remarkable woman, Ms. Turner. Margaret scoffed lightly. I'm just an old woman who happened to be in the right place. Holt shook his head. No. You're exactly where you needed to be. Margaret glanced toward the break room, where Sophie sat between her parents, eating a granola bar, her face no longer lined with fear. She wasn't sure what the future held. But one thing was certain, she wasn't done yet. Margaret sat in the police station, watching as Sophie leaned against her mother, exhaustion evident in her drooping eyelids. The tension in the air had begun to settle, but Margaret knew the storm wasn't over yet. Lucas Grant was in custody, but questions remained. Why had he targeted Sophie? Had he done this before? Detective Holt sat across from Margaret, his sharp eyes scanning his notes. He had been quiet for the last few minutes, letting her words settle. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. Miss Turner, he said, I need to go over one more thing before we proceed. Margaret straightened in her seat. Of course. Holt leaned forward. The moment at the park, when you first made eye contact with Lucas, did you get the impression that he recognized Sophie? Margaret frowned, considering the question. She replayed the scene in her mind, the way Lucas had stood just beyond the trees, the way he had watched Sophie, almost as if he were waiting. He never called her name, she admitted. He never spoke to her directly. But, Holt prompted. Margaret's fingers tightened around her paper cup. But he wasn't just looking at her. He was assessing her? Holt nodded, jotting something down. That's what I thought. Margaret's stomach twisted. What are you thinking, detective? Holt exhaled slowly. We don't think Lucas Grant was a random predator. We think he's part of something bigger. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. Something bigger, she echoed. Sophie wasn't just a target of opportunity, Holt explained. He had been watching her for days. Possibly longer. He paused before adding, this wasn't the first time he tried to take a child. Margaret's grip on the cup tightened. So why was he still walking free? Holt's jaw tensed. Because he's careful. He's smart. He's been reported before, but he never leaves enough behind for us to hold him. He set his pen down and met her gaze. Until today? Margaret swallowed hard. And what happens now? He is being questioned, Holt said. But people like him? They rarely talk. Our best shot at keeping him off the streets is building a strong case, and you, Ms. Turner, are our key witness. Margaret's breath caught. Me? Holt nodded. You were there. You saw him watching Sophie. You heard the way Sophie begged you to protect her. You saw the way he ran when we arrived. Margaret's chest felt heavy. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she knew what Holt was asking. She couldn't walk away from this. Before she could answer, a commotion erupted down the hall. Margaret's heart rate spiked. Then she heard the words that made her blood run cold. He's demanding to speak to the woman from the park. Margaret's stomach clenched. Lucas Grant wanted to see her. Holt stood, his eyes narrowing. Absolutely not. But Margaret wasn't sure. If Lucas was willing to talk to her, maybe she could get answers. Maybe she could make sure this never happened again. Before she could make a decision, the door opened, and an officer stepped inside. He says he'll only talk if she's in the room. Holt turned to Margaret, his face unreadable. It's your call. Margaret took a deep breath. She had spent her life as an observer, as someone who watched the world pass by. But today? Today, she was part of the fight. She met Holt's gaze. I'll do it. The interrogation room. The room was small, sterile, the walls a dull gray that seemed to absorb sound. A single table sat in the center, with two chairs positioned across from each other. Lucas Grant sat on one side, his hands cuffed to the table. His face was eerily calm, his dark eyes unreadable. Margaret had seen many things in her life, grief, loss, anger, but never evil. Until now. She stepped inside, every nerve in her body on edge. Holt stood beside her, his presence a steady force of reassurance. Lucas tilted his head, his gaze flickering over Margaret as though he were analyzing her, trying to find weakness. I expected someone younger, he said, his voice smooth, measured. Margaret didn't flinch. And I expected someone more intelligent. A flicker of amusement crossed Lucas's face. You're braver than I thought. Margaret's expression hardened. Why Sophie? Lucas leaned back slightly. Why does it matter? Margaret's hands curled into fists. Because she's a child. Because you hunted her? Lucas's lips curled. You think I hunted her? Margaret's stomach churned. Didn't you? He chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. She was just one of many. Margaret felt cold. Holt stepped forward. Where are the others? Lucas turned his gaze to him. You're assuming there are others. Holt's eyes darkened. We're assuming nothing. We know what you are. Lucas smirked. Then prove it. Margaret inhaled sharply. He wasn't afraid. He thought he'd get away with this. Her nails dug into her palms. You're going to rot in prison. Lucas's smirk didn't fade. Maybe. He tilted his head. Or maybe you just got lucky today, old woman. Margaret's heart pounded. She had never wanted to hurt someone before, but looking at him, knowing what he had almost done to Sophie, she wanted him to suffer. Holt placed a firm hand on her shoulder. That's enough, he said. Margaret exhaled shakily, stepping back. She had gotten what she needed. Lucas had admitted it. Sophie wasn't his only target. And now, they had more than enough to bury him. Margaret turned away, but before she reached the door, Lucas spoke again. Tell the girl, he murmured, that I'll see her again soon. Margaret froze. Holt moved so fast that Margaret barely registered it. He slammed his hands on the table, leaning down until his face was mere inches from Lucas's. You'll never see the outside of a prison cell again, Holt growled. Lucas just smiled. Margaret forced herself to keep walking. She wouldn't let him win. Because now? Sophie had an army protecting her. And Margaret was leading the charge. Margaret stepped out of the interrogation room, her hands trembling at her sides. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, as if the air inside the station had thickened, suffocating her. The weight of Lucas Grant's words clung to her like a heavy coat, seeping into her bones. Tell the girl that I'll see her again soon. The words replayed in her mind like a dark promise, twisting her stomach into knots. He was taunting her. He knew exactly what he was doing, planting doubt, planting fear. But Margaret wouldn't let him win. She wouldn't let Sophie spend another second looking over her shoulder. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to focus. She had done what needed to be done. Lucas was in custody now, and his arrogance had given the police enough evidence to dig deeper into his past. Margaret glanced to the side, where Detective Holt stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He had been silent since slamming Lucas against the table, but now he exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "That man," Holt muttered, shaking his head. "He enjoys the game?" Margaret nodded, her voice hoarse. "Yes. But we're not going to let him play anymore." Holt looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, he gave a small nod. "No, we're not." The sound of hurried footsteps pulled Margaret's attention toward the hallway. A moment later, Emily and David Dawson appeared, with Sophie between them. Sophie's small hand was tucked into her mother's, her face still pale, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. The moment the little girl spotted Margaret, her lips parted in relief. "Grandma Margaret." The title caught Margaret off guard, again, but she barely had time to process it before Sophie ran straight into her arms. Margaret caught her, holding her close, feeling the child's tiny heartbeat thudding against her chest. "I was so scared," Sophie whispered, her voice muffled against Margaret's cardigan. "I don't want to go back home. What if he gets out?" Margaret tightened her grip, pressing a soft kiss to Sophie's hair. "He won't, sweetheart. The police have him now. He can't hurt you anymore." Sophie trembled. "But he said—" "I know what he said," Margaret interrupted gently. "And he was lying. He just wanted to scare us." "But do you know what?" Sophie sniffled, looking up at her. "What?" Margaret cupped her cheek. "He's the one who should be afraid now. Because you have all of us. Your parents, Detective Holt, the officers here, and me. We won't let him near you ever again." Sophie stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Emily wiped at her eyes. "We should take her home," she said, her voice thick. "She needs rest." Holt cleared his throat. "Before you go, I want you to know that Lucas Grant will be facing multiple charges. We'll do everything in our power to make sure he's locked away for a very long time." David exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Thank you, Detective." Holt nodded. "We'll also have officers patrolling your neighborhood for the next few weeks. And if you need anything, don't hesitate to call." Margaret glanced at Emily and David, taking in the way they both looked at Sophie, like they had almost lost her. Maybe, in some ways, they had. Margaret knew what it was like to lose people, to have time slip through her fingers before she realized how much she had taken for granted. Emily crouched beside Sophie, brushing back her daughter's hair. "Let's go home, sweetheart." Sophie hesitated, her grip on Margaret's cardigan tightening. Margaret smiled softly. "Go on, dear. Your parents will take care of you." Sophie looked up at her, her voice small. "Will I see you again?" Margaret's heart clenched. Before today, she had been nothing more than a quiet presence in the park, a woman watching the world from a distance. But now? She mattered to this little girl. And she wasn't about to walk away from that. "Of course you will," Margaret said, stroking Sophie's cheek. "You and I have many more afternoons in the park to look forward to." Sophie's lips curled into a sleepy, trusting smile. "Okay." Emily and David exchanged glances before David cleared his throat. "Margaret," he said carefully, Would you like to join us for dinner tomorrow?" Margaret blinked in surprise. "Dinner?" Emily nodded, squeezing Sophia's hand. "Sophie, won't stop talking about you. And after everything you've done for us, we'd love to have you." Margaret hesitated. It had been so long since she had shared a meal with anyone. Her evenings were spent alone in her quiet home, her only company the faint sound of her radio and the ticking of her old grandfather clock. But tonight, as she looked at Sophie's hopeful eyes, she realized that maybe it was time for that to change. "I would love that," Margaret said warmly. Sophie beamed. As the Dawsons walked toward the exit, Margaret watched them go, a strange warmth settling in her chest. She had stepped into that park today expecting nothing more than another quiet afternoon. But she had walked away with something she never expected, a family. Holt stepped beside her, crossing his arms. You're something else, Miss Turner. Margaret chuckled, glancing up at him. Is that a compliment, detective? Holt smirked. Let's just say I've seen a lot of things in my years as an officer. But a retired school teacher standing up to a predator and protecting a child like that? He shook his head in admiration. That's not something I'll forget anytime soon. Margaret's smile softened. Neither will I. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted her. She inhaled deeply, letting it wash over her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. She felt needed. She felt alive. And as she walked toward her home, she knew this was only the beginning. Margaret sat at her small wooden dining table, staring at the steaming cup of tea in front of her. The rhythmic ticking of her grandfather clock echoed through the quiet house, but tonight, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. The events of the day had settled over her like a heavy quilt. She had stepped into Willow Park, expecting nothing more than her usual quiet afternoon, and yet, somehow, she had become a guardian for a little girl who now saw her as family. The thought sent a warmth through Margaret's chest, one she hadn't felt in years. The ring of her doorbell startled her from her thoughts. She blinked, shaking off her exhaustion. Before standing. Few people ever visited her, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if it was Holt. With an update. But as she opened the door, she found herself looking into the weary yet relieved faces of Emily and David Dawson. Emily clutched a small paper bag in her hands, offering a hesitant smile. We didn't mean to intrude, she said softly, but Sophie fell asleep before we could properly thank you, and I just couldn't rest until I told you how much this means to us. Margaret's chest tightened. She glanced past them, half expecting to see Sophie peeking out from behind her parents, but she wasn't there. She's sleeping soundly, David assured her, rubbing the back of his neck. For the first time in days, Margaret let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Good, she said sincerely, stepping aside. Come in. They hesitated only briefly before entering. Margaret led them into the cozy living room, where the fireplace cast flickering shadows across the room. Emily set the paper bag on the coffee table. It's just a small gift, she murmured as a thank you. Margaret waved her off. You don't owe me anything. Emily swallowed hard, glancing at her husband before turning back to Margaret. No, we do. Margaret waited, sensing that Emily needed to say more. I keep replaying everything in my mind, Emily continued, her voice trembling. How Sophie must have been so scared. And the worst part is, she tried to tell us. She said she saw someone. Near the school, near our house. But we were always too busy, too distracted, and we told her not to worry. David exhaled, his expression lined with guilt. We brushed it off, convinced ourselves it was nothing. But it wasn't. And because of that, she ran away when she should have come to us. Margaret's heart ached for them. She could see the weight of their realization pressing down on them, the regret of not listening sooner. She loves you both, Margaret said gently. Children don't stop needing their parents just because they make mistakes. Emily's lip trembled. But what if something had happened to her? What if? Margaret reached across the table, taking Emily's hand in her own. What matters is that she's safe now. And she knows, without a doubt, how much you love her. Emily blinked back tears. And because of you, we still have the chance to make things right? Margaret hesitated, then squeezed Emily's hand. I was just in the right place at the right time. David shook his head. No, Margaret. You were exactly where you needed to be. Silence stretched between them, comfortable yet profound. Margaret thought of how she had once convinced herself she was done making an impact in people's lives. That no one needed her anymore. But today had changed that. Emily sniffled and sat up straighter. I want to do better. I will do better. No more missed moments. No more telling Sophie we don't have time. Margaret smiled. She's lucky to have you both. David exhaled, rubbing his face before looking at Margaret again. Sophie talks about you like you've always been part of her life. I've never seen her trust someone so quickly. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a strange and wonderful ache that had nothing to do with age. She makes it easy, she admitted. David hesitated, exchanging a glance with his wife before turning back to Margaret. We were serious about dinner tomorrow, he said. Not just because of what happened today, but because Sophie already sees you as family. And we'd like to get to know the woman who saved our daughter's life. Margaret's throat tightened. She had spent so many years alone. But maybe it didn't have to be that way anymore. I'd love that, she said softly. Emily exhaled a breath of relief, her shoulders finally losing some of their tension. Good. David smiled, and for the first time that evening, it reached his eyes. Emily reached for the paper bag again and slid it toward Margaret. And before we go, we wanted you to have this. Margaret gave her a curious look before untying the bag. Inside, she found a beautifully wrapped box. She peeled back the paper carefully, revealing a framed photograph. Her breath caught. It was a picture of her and Sophie in the park. One of the officers must have taken it in the aftermath of the chaos. It was a moment she hadn't even realized had been captured. Sophie curled up against her, Margaret's arms wrapped protectively around her as if she had always belonged there. The image stole the words from her lips. Emily's voice was soft. Now you'll always remember that she'll never forget you. Margaret blinked rapidly, her fingers tracing the frame's smooth edges. She didn't need a photo to remember. This day, this moment, had changed everything. But still, she clutched it close. Because for the first time in years, she felt like she had a place in someone's life again. She looked up, meeting their eyes, her heart swelling with something deep and unshakable. Thank you, she whispered. Emily smiled through her tears. David clapped a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. We'll see you tomorrow. As they left, Margaret stood in her doorway for a long while, staring at the photograph in her hands. Tomorrow. For the first time in years, she had something to look forward to. She had people to look forward to. And as she finally closed the door and set the picture on her mantel, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. The next evening, Margaret found herself standing in front of a house she had never been to, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, nervousness. She had been invited to dinner before, long ago, when her own children were young, when the house had been filled with laughter and the scent of home-cooked meals. But tonight, as she clutched the small dish of biscuits she had baked earlier that afternoon, she hesitated at the doorstep. She wasn't just here as a guest, she was stepping into their world. Before she could knock, the door swung open, and Sophie's bright eyes peered up at her, glowing with excitement. Grandma Margaret, the little girl squealed, throwing her arms around Margaret's waist. Margaret barely had time to react before she was being tugged inside, the warmth of the Dawson home immediately wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. You came. Sophie grinned, her brown pigtails bouncing. Margaret smiled, smoothing Sophie's hair. Of course I did, sweetheart. Emily appeared in the doorway, an apron tied around her waist, her face glowing with relief. Margaret, it's so good to see you. David was behind her, holding a bowl of mashed potatoes. We're glad you could make it. Margaret felt the tension in her shoulders ease. I wouldn't have missed it. As she stepped fully into their home, she took in the warm, inviting space. Family photos lined the walls, a bookshelf filled with children's books sat in the corner, and the scent of something delicious wafted from the kitchen. It felt alive. It felt like home. Come see my room, Sophie announced, already pulling Margaret toward the hallway. Margaret chuckled, allowing herself to be led into a small bedroom painted in soft pastel colors. Stuffed animals sat neatly on the bed, a collection of crayons and coloring books sprawled across a small desk. This is my favorite, Sophie said, picking up a stuffed bunny. Mom says I had him since I was a baby. Margaret smiled. He looks well loved. Sophie nodded, then set him down carefully before turning back to Margaret, her expression suddenly serious. Are you staying forever? Margaret's breath caught. She knelt beside the child, taking her small hands in hers. Sweetheart, I'll always be here when you need me. Sophie tilted her head. Like a real grandma. Margaret's heart swelled. If you want me to be? Sophie's face lit up with joy. She threw her arms around Margaret's neck, hugging her tightly. I do. Margaret blinked back the sudden sting of tears. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this. This warmth, this connection. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged. Dinner was lively. Emily had prepared a feast: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, and warm bread. Sophie chattered endlessly about school, about the park, about the book she had started reading. Margaret listened, her heart full. David raised his glass. To Margaret, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. For keeping our daughter safe and for becoming part of our family. Margaret's throat tightened. She wasn't just an old woman who fed pigeons in the park anymore. She was someone's family again. She lifted her glass. To family, she said softly. As they clinked glasses and laughter filled the air, Margaret knew, this was only the beginning. And for the first time in a long, long time, she was home. Margaret sat in the Dawsons' living room, watching as Sophie happily colored at the coffee table. The evening had been filled with warmth, laughter, and a deep sense of belonging, something Margaret hadn't experienced in years. Dinner had been delicious, the conversation light yet meaningful. Margaret had found herself slipping into the role of family, something she hadn't realized she had missed so much. Emily and David had made it clear that this wasn't just a one-time invitation. They wanted her here. Sophie wanted her here. Margaret's fingers traced the rim of her teacup, the warmth seeping into her palms. She glanced at Emily and David, who sat across from her, their expressions softer now, the exhaustion of the past. Few days lingering but not as sharp. "Thank you for coming tonight, Margaret," Emily said, her voice filled with sincerity. "It means a lot to us." Margaret smiled. "It means a lot to me too." David nodded, his gaze flickering to Sophie before returning to Margaret. "We wanted to ask you something," he said carefully. Margaret raised an eyebrow, curiosity stirring in her chest. "Oh," Emily exhaled, glancing at her husband before speaking. "Sophie hasn't stopped talking about you. She feels safe with you, Margaret. And we were wondering if you'd like to be a more permanent part of her life." Margaret's breath caught. "What do you mean?" David cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "We know it's a lot to ask, and we don't want you to feel any pressure. But Sophie adores you. And we'd love for you to be more involved. Maybe come over for dinner regularly? Spend time with her? Be a real grandmother to her." Margaret's heart swelled. She glanced at Sophie, who was still lost in her coloring, humming softly to herself. A grandmother. It had been so long since someone had needed her like this. She had spent so many years convincing herself she was fine on her own. That her role in life was over. But looking at Sophie, this sweet, bright little girl who had run to her for help, she realized she had been wrong. She wasn't done. And she didn't want to be. Margaret swallowed past the lump in her throat. I would love that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Emily's face broke into a smile. "Really?" Margaret nodded, glancing at Sophie with affection. "Really?" David let out a breath of relief. "That's wonderful." Margaret turned to Sophie. "What do you think, dear? Would you like me to spend more time with you?" Sophie's head shot up, her eyes bright. Yes. Can you come to my school play next month? I am going to be a tree." Margaret chuckled, warmth filling her chest. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Sophie grinned, bouncing slightly on her knees. Emily reached over, squeezing Margaret's hand. "Welcome to the family." Margaret squeezed back, blinking away tears. She had found a new purpose. A new home. And for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Margaret walked home that evening with a new sense of purpose. The air was crisp, the streetlights casting a warm glow on the pavement, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still at the Dawsons' house, still wrapped in the warmth of their invitation, still hearing Sophie's excited voice calling her grandma Margaret. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this, to be needed. Her house was quiet when she stepped inside, as it always was. But tonight, for the first time in years, the solitude didn't feel so overwhelming. She glanced at the framed photo Emily had given her, still sitting on the mantel where she had left it. She picked it up, studying the image of herself and Sophie on the park bench, the little girl curled into her side. A smile tugged at Margaret's lips. This was just the beginning. The next few weeks, Margaret quickly became a fixture in Sophie's life. She visited the Dawsons often, joining them for dinner at least twice a week. She and Sophie spent time in the park, feeding pigeons, reading books together on the swings, and even baking cookies at Margaret's house. Sophie had declared Margaret's cookies to be the best ever, though Margaret suspected she enjoyed the process more than the taste. Margaret found herself enjoying the time spent with Emily and David as well. She learned more about their lives, their work, their struggles as parents. They confided in her, sought her advice, treated her like family. And it wasn't just them. Margaret began to open herself up to the world again. She started greeting the parents she saw at the park, striking up conversations, getting to know the people around her. She was no longer just a quiet woman on a bench, she was part of the community. Sophie's school play. The day of Sophie's school play arrived, and Margaret was seated in the front row, holding her breath as the curtain rose. Sophie stood on stage, dressed in a green costume, her face glowing with excitement as she spotted Margaret in the audience. Margaret beamed back, giving her a small wave. Sophie's lines were simple. After all, she was a tree, but she delivered them with pride, standing tall, her voice clear and confident. Margaret clapped louder than anyone when the play ended, her heart swelling with pride. Afterward, Sophie ran up to her, throwing her arms around Margaret's waist. "Did you see me?" Sophie asked breathlessly. Margaret laughed, hugging her tightly. "You were the finest tree I've ever seen." Sophie giggled. "You promise?" Margaret placed a hand over her heart. "I promise." Emily and David stood beside them, smiling warmly. "She was incredible," Emily said, ruffling Sophie's hair. David nodded. "And she wouldn't stop talking about how excited she was that you'd be here." Margaret's heart softened. She hadn't just been invited into this family, she had become an essential part of it. And she wouldn't trade that for anything in the world. As they walked toward the parking lot, hand in hand with Sophie, Margaret looked up at the stars, feeling more at peace than she had in years. She had found her place, her new beginning. And she wasn't going anywhere. Margaret sat in her cozy living room, sipping a cup of tea while listening to the soft ticking of her grandfather clock. The evening was quiet, the way it always had been, yet something had changed. For the past few weeks, her life had become fuller, warmer. Sophie and the Dawsons had given her something she hadn't realized she was missing, a family. But as much as Margaret felt grateful for this newfound connection, something still lingered in the back of her mind. Lucas Grant. The man who had followed Sophie, who had been arrested that night, who had promised he would see her again. Margaret set her cup down, frowning. He was in custody, but cases like his didn't just disappear overnight. What if he found a loophole? What if he got out? The very thought sent a chill through her bones. She had promised Sophie that she was safe now. She intended to keep that promise. A visit to the station. The next morning, Margaret made her way to the police station. Detective Holt had given her his card, telling her she could reach out if she needed anything. She hadn't expected to actually use it. As she stepped inside, she spotted Holt near his desk, sifting through paperwork. When he looked up and saw her, his brows lifted slightly in surprise. "Ms. Turner," he greeted, standing. "Didn't expect to see you here." Margaret offered a polite smile, but she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need to know about Lucas Grant." Holt sighed, motioning for her to sit. "I figured you'd ask eventually." Margaret took a seat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Is he still in custody?" Holt nodded. "Yes. He is being held without bail, which means he is not walking out anytime soon." Margaret exhaled in relief. "But," Holt added, "his lawyer is pushing for a plea deal." Margaret stiffened. "A deal?" Holt's expression darkened. "They're claiming he wasn't trying to kidnap Sophie, just watching out for her because he thought she was unsafe at home." Margaret's stomach turned. "That's absurd." Holt nodded. "We know it's a lie, but his lawyer is trying to spin it. We need strong testimony to ensure he doesn't get a reduced sentence." Margaret's heart pounded. "You need me?" Holt hesitated, then nodded. "Your statement could be the key to making sure he stays locked up." Margaret swallowed. She had never testified in court before. The thought of standing in front of strangers, reliving that terrifying day, facing Lucas Grant again, it made her uneasy. But then she thought of Sophie. She thought of how scared the little girl had been, of how she had clung to her, trusting her to keep her safe. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I'll do it," she said firmly. Holt studied her for a moment, then nodded. You're a strong woman, Miss Turner. Margaret smiled faintly. I've had a lifetime of practice. An important conversation. That evening, Margaret sat with Emily and David on their porch while Sophie played in the yard. She hadn't told them about the trial yet. She wasn't sure how. But they deserved to know. Margaret took a deep breath. I need to talk to you both about Lucas Grant. Emily and David immediately tensed. What about him? David asked. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. He's still in custody, but his lawyer is trying to lessen his sentence. I've agreed to testify. Emily's eyes widened. Margaret, are you sure? Margaret nodded. I have to. He can't walk free. Not after what he's done. David exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. We should be the ones doing this, not you. Margaret reached over, squeezing his hand. You have to protect Sophie. I can do this. Emily swallowed hard, emotion clouding her eyes. We'll be there. Whatever you need, we'll be there. Margaret smiled. That's all I ask. As they sat together, watching Sophie chase fireflies, Margaret knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The courtroom was colder than Margaret expected. The walls were stark, the lighting sterile, and despite the presence of multiple people, lawyers, officers, even the judge, the room felt eerily quiet. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, trying to suppress the nervous energy running through her veins. She had never been in a courtroom before. But she wasn't here for herself. She was here for Sophie. Detective Holt had briefed her on what to expect, but nothing could have fully prepared her for seeing Lucas Grant again. He sat at the defendant's table, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. His face was as calm as ever, as if none of this truly affected him. His lawyer, a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit, whispered something in his ear, and Lucas nodded, smirking slightly as if this were all just a game. Margaret's stomach turned. She had seen monsters in movies, in books. But she never thought she'd see one in real life. And now? She was about to face him. The testimony. Margaret inhaled deeply as she was called to the stand. She walked steadily, keeping her back straight, her chin high. She may have been older, but she wasn't weak. She wouldn't let him see fear. She was sworn in, then the prosecutor, an older woman with sharp eyes, approached her. Miss Turner, can you tell us what happened on the day in question? Margaret nodded and began to recount the events of that fateful day, the moment she first saw Sophie, the fear in the child's eyes, the way Lucas had been lurking, watching. She described the way Sophie had clung to her, whispered for her to pretend they knew each other. She detailed how Lucas had hesitated when he saw her take Sophie in her arms, how his movements had been deliberate, calculated. She spoke of how he ran when the police arrived. And with each word, she made it clear, Lucas Grant had been hunting that little girl. The prosecutor nodded approvingly. Thank you, Miss Turner. Margaret exhaled softly. She had done what she came here to do. But then, it was his lawyer's turn. The defense's attempt. The defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie as he stepped forward. Miss Turner, he began, his voice smooth, almost polite. You claim that my client was watching young Sophie Dawson that day. Margaret's lips pressed together. I don't claim it. I know it. The lawyer's mouth twitched slightly. And yet, he never spoke to her. Never tried to grab her. Never physically harmed her in any way. Margaret narrowed her eyes. That doesn't mean he wasn't a threat. The lawyer clasped his hands in front of him, pacing slightly. Is it possible, Miss Turner, that you misunderstood his intentions? That he was simply concerned for Sophie? Margaret's fingers curled into fists. Concerned, she repeated, her voice cold. The lawyer gave a sympathetic shrug. My client insists that he believed Sophie was in danger. That her parents weren't taking proper care of her. That he only followed her because he wanted to ensure her safety. Margaret felt anger bubble inside her. That's a lie, she said firmly. The lawyer's eyebrows raised. You seem very sure of that. Margaret stared directly at Lucas Grant. I know what I saw, she said, her voice steady. And I know that little girl was terrified of him. The lawyer opened his mouth to say something else, but before he could, Lucas laughed. It was a low chuckle, quiet enough that only those closest to him heard. But Margaret did. She saw the way his lips curled slightly, as if he were enjoying this. Enjoying the game. Margaret's spine straightened. She turned back to the defense attorney. "Tell me," she said, her voice unwavering. "If Lucas was so concerned about Sophie, why did he run?" Silence. The lawyer's jaw tightened. He had no response. The prosecutor smirked slightly. "No further questions, Your Honor." Margaret stepped down from the stand, her heart still pounding. She had done it. Now, it was in the judge's hands. The verdict. The trial lasted a few more hours, but Margaret barely processed the rest of it. She sat in her seat, her hands clasped together, waiting. And then, finally, the verdict came. "Lucas Grant, you are found guilty on all charges." Margaret exhaled sharply. It was over. She glanced at Emily and David, who sat beside her, both of them visibly emotional. Emily wiped away tears, while David let out a deep breath, relief washing over his features. And then, she looked at Sophie. The little girl sat quietly, her hands gripping her mother's sleeve. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling. She was just watching. Margaret reached over, gently taking Sophie's small hand in hers. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered. Sophie turned to her, hesitated for a moment, and then leaned into her side, resting her head against Margaret's arm. Margaret swallowed past the lump in her throat. Yes. She was safe. Moving forward. That night, Margaret sat with the Dawsons for dinner once again. But this time, there was no underlying fear. No what ifs. Sophie was laughing, telling Margaret about her new school project. Emily was more present, listening intently. David was relaxed, finally at peace. Margaret smiled, feeling something warm and unshakable settle in her chest. She had spent so long thinking her life was quietly coming to an end. But now? She realized she had been given a second chance. A chance to love. A chance to protect. A chance to be part of something bigger than herself. And as Sophie squeezed her hand under the table, Margaret knew. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Margaret sat on the Dawsons' porch, sipping tea as Sophie played in the yard. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant laughter of children from a nearby park. It had been a few weeks since the trial, and life had finally settled into something peaceful. Lucas Grant was gone, locked away for good. Sophie no longer looked over her shoulder. No more nightmares. No more waking up in a panic. She was just a child again. And Margaret? Margaret had never felt more alive. A change in routine. Before Sophie, Margaret's days had been predictable: wake up, walk to the park, feed the pigeons, sit alone. But now? Now, her mornings were filled with visits from Sophie, who would show up at her doorstep before school, just to say good morning. Her afternoons were spent helping Sophie with homework, baking cookies, and talking with Emily and David over tea. And her evenings? They were no longer spent in solitude. She had family now. An unexpected idea. One afternoon, as Margaret and Sophie sat at the park, feeding the pigeons, Sophie spoke up. "Grandma Margaret?" Margaret smiled at the title, one she had grown to love. "Yes, dear." Sophie kicked her feet. "Do you think other kids get scared like I was?" Margaret's heart clenched. "I think so, sweetheart." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "I wish they had someone like you." Margaret stilled. She had been so focused on protecting Sophie that she hadn't thought about the others. How many children were afraid right now? How many people like Lucas Grant were still out there, waiting? Margaret's mind raced. She had spent years feeling like she had nothing left to give. But now? She had purpose. She could help. Margaret turned to Sophie, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe we can do something about that?" Sophie beamed. "Like what?" Margaret wasn't sure yet. But she knew one thing: she wasn't done fighting. A conversation with Holt. That evening, Margaret called Detective Holt. "You're full of surprises, Miss Turner," he said with a chuckle. "What can I do for you?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I want to help." Holt paused. "Help?" Margaret nodded, gripping the phone tightly. "I don't want to just move on from this. There are other children like Sophie. Other families who don't see the warning signs. I want to do something." Holt was silent for a long moment. Then, he said, "You know, we could use someone like you." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Really? Really?" Holt said. "We work with community outreach programs, helping parents recognize threats, educating kids on what to do if they feel unsafe." A woman like you? Someone who's lived it? You could make a real difference. Margaret swallowed, emotion swelling in her chest. A difference. For the first time in years, she had a reason to wake up excited. I want to do it, she said firmly. Holt chuckled. I had a feeling you would. A new chapter begins. Margaret hung up the phone, her hands still shaking, but not from fear. From excitement. She had spent years thinking she was done. That she had nothing left to offer the world. But now, as she looked at the family she had found, the little girl who had changed everything, Margaret knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done. Not even close. And this? This was only the beginning. Margaret stood at the front of a small community center, her hands clasped in front of her as she took in the faces of the people before her. Parents, teachers, and even a few officers from the police department had gathered to hear her speak. Some looked curious, others skeptical, but all of them were listening. A few months ago, Margaret never would have imagined herself here. But now? Now, she had a mission. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. My name is Margaret Turner, she began. A few months ago, I was just an old woman sitting in the park, feeding the pigeons. I thought my days of making a difference were long behind me. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room. But then, I met a little girl named Sophie. A little girl who was being watched by a predator. A little girl who was afraid, and no one noticed. A murmur went through the crowd, and Margaret continued. I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. But luck isn't enough. We can't just hope someone will be there to protect our children. We have to be that someone. She took a step forward, her voice unwavering. We need to listen to our children when they tell us something feels wrong. We need to pay attention to the people around us, to the changes in our kids' behavior, to the little things that don't seem important until it's too late. She glanced toward the back of the room, where Sophie sat between Emily and David, listening. With wide eyes. Margaret smiled. This isn't just about protecting children, she continued. It's about empowering them. Teaching them to trust their instincts, to speak up when something doesn't feel right. To know that they are never alone. The room was silent, but Margaret could feel the weight of her words settling over them. Then, applause. Soft at first, then growing louder. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. They understood. They cared. And together, they were going to make a difference. A new beginning. That night, after the event, Margaret sat on her porch, watching the stars twinkle in the sky. She had spent so many years alone. So many years thinking her best days were behind her. But now, she had a family. She had a purpose. Sophie ran up the porch steps, plopping down beside her with a grin. You were amazing. Grandma Margaret. Margaret chuckled, wrapping an arm around Sophie's shoulders. Thank you, dear. Emily and David stepped onto the porch, smiles on their faces. You're really something else, David said, shaking his head. You've changed all of our lives. Margaret smiled softly. You all changed mine too. Emily stepped forward, squeezing Margaret's hand. We love you, Margaret. You're part of our family now. Always. Margaret's heart swelled. She had found her place in the world again. Not just as a grandmother to Sophie. Not just as a protector. But as a woman who still had so much left to give. As she sat there, surrounded by the people she had come to love, Margaret knew one thing for certain. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The end.